Forum at Harvard Kennedy School. I'm Doug Elmendorf, the Dean of the Kennedy School. I was excited to help organize tonight's event, and I'm looking forward to joining all of you in learning from the perspectives of our distinguished guests. My only role tonight is to introduce our moderator. Kristen Soltis Anderson was a fellow here at the Institute of Politics, and we are delighted that she's back tonight to moderate this evening's discussion. Kristen is the author of The Selfie Vote, Where Millennials Are Leading America and How Republicans Can Keep Up. She is a political contributor to ABC News, a columnist for the Washington Examiner, the co-host of The Pollsters, which is a weekly bipartisan podcast, and a regular guest on Morning Joe, Fox News Sunday, and Real Time with Bill Mayer. Also, I've heard it's her birthday today, so let's start by wishing her a very happy birthday. And I will let Kristen introduce our speakers and get started. Kristen, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the kind birthday wishes. I appreciate it. So today we are here to talk about a big question, which is, what is the future of the conservative agenda? The election results last year have given some folks in the conservative movement a lot of reason to celebrate. But the story may not be as simple as that, and I think tonight we're going to have a very interesting discussion about the pros and cons of the election and what this all sort of means for conservatism in the next coming years. And to discuss this with me, we have three fantastic panelists. I'll start with the person right on my left. Jim Pethokoukis, he's a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a CNBC contributor. Next to him, we have April Ponnuru. She is the senior fellow, or senior advisor at the Conservative Reform Network and was policy advisor to Jeb Bush's presidential campaign. And finally, Oren Cass, a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, and he was a domestic policy director of Mitt Romney's 2012 campaign. So thank you very much to the three of you for joining. And I want to kick it off with a question that I'd like each of you to answer, which is, President Trump has not really used the word conservative to describe himself, much, if at all. There are questions about to what extent he is a conservative. And yet this election was considered a pretty big win for conservatives. What do you think are the prospects for achieving conservative victories in the next 4 years? Jim?
Well, listen, after the election, people who had been very close to the Trump campaign told me that, and maybe this was a poor choice of word for Trump, that there was going to be a blitzkrieg of legislation coming out of this administration. Very fast. My head was going to spin. There's going to be Obamacare reform, tax reform. There's going to be, and now it looks like things have slowed down a little bit. If we were sitting here in the summer of 2018 and saying, gee, Republicans, they're still going to cut taxes, but it's already been like a year and a half, I wouldn't be surprised. So I think that agenda has slowed down. It would be shocking if at the end of 4 years there aren't some, I think, conservative victories. I mean, considering they have the presidency, they have both houses of Congress, at least they will for 2 years, that there's not major health care reform, there's not major tax reform, which are parts of the conservative agenda. So you'd be shocked if that didn't happen. But there are other bits which you would call traditional conservative policies, or at least they have been over the last decade, such as entitlement reform. It would be shocking if they did happen, since President Trump has said he doesn't want to do entitlement reform. For a long time, obviously, conservatives were for more free trade agreements. That's not going to happen. In fact, it's going the other direction. So there certainly are key pieces of what you would call the conservative agenda, which probably aren't going to happen, and I'm going to end it for the moment, but I will say that I think there's more to being conservative than like a 10-point plan, agenda policies. It's not really, I think, about what marginal tax rates are. Maybe we can get into that later.
April, what do you think? What do you think the prospects are for a conservative agenda or conservative policy victories in the next 4 years?
Well, I don't know that it counts as a policy victory, but I think it counts as a conservative victory. Neil Gorsuch, I don't think we can underestimate how important that is, certainly to a conservative base. A lot of conservatives voted for Trump precisely for this reason. I was one of the Republicans probably making the argument that this was unlikely to happen, that he would nominate someone. I think as solidly conservative and constitutionalist as someone like Gorsuch, I'm very pleased by that nomination. But in terms of policy, I think it's going to be a much harder road. We've got a president who wants to do some very big things: tax reform, repeal and replace of Obamacare, infrastructure, build up the military, all kinds of things that cost a lot of money. And he has a Congress that is very interested in balanced budgets, or at least the appearance of balanced budgets. And it's very hard to square, the budget priorities of conservatives, and certainly conservatives in Congress, with the wish list of Donald Trump. So it really comes down to, what those priorities are going to be. And I think that Congress is going to have an unusually powerful role to play in this process. For one reason, because Trump is really not a conservative. I mean, I think that'll be my, I'll posit that, and we certainly happy to take questions about that. But I mean, he hasn't really identified as such in any real way. He's the things that conservatives care most about, things like free markets, fiscal conservatism, even social issues, are things that Donald Trump either just barely tolerates or is opposed, hostile to. And so, he's really not with us on a policy agenda. What he is very effective at doing, I think, is sort of channeling the frustration of people. And I think it's sort of up to Congress to sort of take hold of some of these issues that he identifies, some of these frustrations, and to sort of match policy with these concerns. I mean, frankly, I don't think Congress has done that great of a job at this in the past. I think we've had an agenda that has largely not, responded to the concerns of average Americans and what they're really worried about, things like wage stagnation and the fact that college is way too expensive for their kids anymore. Any number of issues. Congress hasn't been terribly responsive to those issues. And so I think this is really an opportunity for Congress to recalibrate, to take some of that anger that Trump identified, and I think in many places sort of whipped up, and see if we can come up with a substantive agenda that'll meet those ends. And then I think it's just a matter of selling that back to the White House. So,
Oren, what do you think broadly are the prospects for conservative policy victories in the next 4 years?
I guess I would divide them into two categories. I think there's a huge scope for positive victories in terms of personnel and in terms of the policies that people can pursue within the executive branch. Neil Gorsuch is obviously an important example, but I think the sorts of things you'll see happening within the Department of Justice, within the EPA, those kinds of things there are actual conservatives now in charge of and will pursue conservative agendas. Donald Trump himself is not a conservative at all, and I guess I am much more pessimistic, certainly than April, maybe than Jim, about the prospect for Congress to make progress given what is at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. Maybe a very long time ago, Congress had the capacity to create comprehensive legislation in the face of a White House distraction. I don't think it does today. I don't think Republicans in Congress are unified enough to move forward without strong leadership from a White House. And I think they're getting exactly the opposite. And one of the things about conservative policy, my guess is the way we would all define it, is it's not necessarily all that politically popular all that time. It is a lot easier to sell health care and health insurance for everybody than to sell the reasons that it's not the right health care reform to pursue. If you have a White House that is tweeting, we will give everyone health care and it will be greater than Obamacare, ! I think that completely destroys the prospect for actually getting a majority in Congress behind something that doesn't do that, because a conservative solution wouldn't do that. And so I think that's the tension on the legislative side that is going to be a huge barrier to really seeing the conservative policy victories that you might expect given who is actually in control of each branch.
So that, I think, leads to a deeper question on what we think is going to happen with the Affordable Care Act. Conservatives for the last number of years have been running on repeal Obamacare, repeal Obamacare, repeal Obamacare. It was a consistent theme in many of the midterm elections in particular, and now we're in a place where the options before Republicans are repeal and replace with X, Repair is an option that has now been thrown out on the table.
Anything that starts REP is an option.
Yes, I think that's repair is now a new buzzword that's been thrown into the mix, or simply allowing it to continue, maybe tinkering at the edges. What do you think is the most likely outcome at this point?
Well, I mean, all of these guys have said that, I mean, by that I mean Republican congressmen have said that, you know, the mandate is unconstitutional. So, I mean, there's a box they're in, they've got to do something. You know, my sense is that this is, you know, a very important priority and should be for Congress, particularly for Paul Ryan, who seems to be the guy who's now in charge of dealing with this. I think McConnell has a sort of studied distance in what concerns him in terms of policy. He's very much concerned with how the Senate runs and that sort of thing, but not too concerned about what the policy outcomes are, I think, particularly on healthcare. So that has sort of fallen to Paul Ryan. The trouble, of course, is that we have 52 votes in the Senate, and that means that any policy changes have to really be done on a vehicle that requires only a majority vote. This year, that's a budget reconciliation bill. As you may know, this is all like very in the weeds, but there may be 2 budget reconciliation packages this year. It's the obvious vehicle to try to do most any policy on this year, just because of that 52 vote threshold. And you know, my guess is that, and what I'm hearing in Capitol Hill is that they're trying to shove all of this into a sort of March bill, that where they're going to try to certainly do tax credits for folks that don't have coverage through an employer plan. They're going to try to, you know, they're going to try to deal with Medicaid, which I think is a huge thing to bite off, but to basically phase out the expansion. I think they're going to try to do a lot in that first package and then do sort of clean up in subsequent, the subsequent reconciliation package. And so I think the question is whether or not they can get that done. I mean, I think it's sort of a quarter baked. There's certainly, I mean, look, for years, Republicans have been trying to get, you know, a consensus on what we do about healthcare, and we're not there. And Ryan's trying to sell it, and we're not there. It certainly isn't going to come from the White House, as Oren said. I mean, we are used to having, you know, a very competent administration. We're used to, you know, the modern presidency has been filled with people who are hyper competent at that job, and they came in with plans, detailed plans about what they wanted pursued, you know, what their policy strategy was. This is not a White House that's doing that. I mean, they've, you know, there's tweets and there's big picture stuff that he wants to do, but there's no substance, and so it really does fall to Ryan. I think Ryan's top priority is taxes, tax reform, and probably second is healthcare, and I think it's going to be really interesting to watch. I don't think they're there. I think it's going to be very hard to get the votes, particularly in the Senate. And you know, I'm not convinced at all that it happens, but I think that they have to, you know, that repair is not really the option. It's got to be repeal, and it's got to be replaced with something substantive.
Oren, do you think the same thing?
I mean, I think the important lens to apply to this is to remember 2009. President Obama came in with a hyper-competent administration of experts who had spent their life planning for this moment, a fully fleshed out plan. He had 60 votes in the Senate, and it still took them a full year. There was the stimulus also, but it essentially took them a full year, the Scott Brown special election here, the reconciliation patch, to get through what, even if you like the Democrat vision of healthcare reform, is a mess of a healthcare reform. And so the idea that Republicans now, without that kind of leadership, having to work from a much more complicated baseline, are going to do this in a couple of months, I think is, it's certainly optimistic. And to the extent that it does happen, I think it's unlikely to happen well. I would certainly defer to April on what is most likely to happen in terms of.
I think they have to try. Like,
well,
you know, I mean, that's it. Like, I don't think they get there. I have a hard time seeing how they get there, but I think they kind of have to try.
And this is a broader theme of what's going on right now. So April's a DC insider. I live in Western Massachusetts. My viewpoint from Western Massachusetts is like, but these things like, it seems so strange that we would be optimistic, and yet I'm also very receptive to the reality that you do have to try, right? You can't just say, well, this isn't going to work, so let's move on. You have to say, well,
I feel like voters would punish Republicans if they
That's
don't
right.
try.
So I think there's this incredibly
Republican
narrow
voters
pathway of, we said what we were going to do, we have to try to do it, and yet, given the actual dynamics here, it's incredibly difficult to see how you get from here to there.
Jim, I want to then talk about the other big reform issue that is confronting Congress, which is tax reform. This is something that has been on the wish list, I don't think just for conservatives. I think the idea of fixing our tax code has been something that folks of both parties have wanted to do for a while. But right now, of course, you have tax reform that is now caught up in questions of not just what are the tax rates, but what do we do about a border adjustment tax, the BAT? What do you think are the prospects for tax reform actually happening?
There was a famous conservative commentator, the late Robert Novak, who said, God put Republicans on earth to cut taxes. And if they can't do that, there's no useful purpose for them. So you would think if there was one issue that they would absolutely right out of the gate be able just to push through the House, push through the Senate, completely planned out, it would be taxes. And that, frankly, is as much of a mess as healthcare reform. As you mentioned, this border adjustment, which about 12 people in Washington understand, I'm not sure many of those are on Capitol Hill. If that piece of it should fall through, then all of a sudden this tax plan, which is going to lose a lot of money, loses a lot more money. It's $1 trillion, and they don't really have a plan B. So that's kind of a mess, and they have sort of hinged a lot of their agenda, of their quote unquote pro-growth agenda, on tax reform. So not only do they have to pass tax reform, but then it also has to have these amazing results on the economy. This well-known hedge fund manager back in December sent out this note to his clients saying that he was very bullish on the market, that he thought that particularly tax reform was that this mere prospect of it was unleashing all the animal spirits. That was not only going to move stocks in the short term, that was going to lead to much faster. I love animal spirits. It's like, I call it like Miyazaki economics. I love the animal spirits, Keynesian, of course. But and if that doesn't happen, I mean, as much as healthcare is a tremendous blow, if you cannot trust the Republican Party to cut taxes, and right now I think that is in question. So we could be here. I said a month and a half, maybe a year and a half, maybe after 2 years, and those are supposed to be we get the big things done. 2 years, that's when you had the stimulus and Obamacare and Dodd-Frank, those first 2 years. If that doesn't get done, then this administration, I think, and Congress look like a complete and abject failure.
And of course, after 2 years, you go into a midterm election where the numbers in Congress afterwards may not look quite the same. And I think a big piece of that will be, to what extent does that economic growth you talked about actually materialize? And so, Jim, I'll come to you first on this. Do you think that, let's say that something happens, repeal and replace happens, tax reform happens. Do you think that, as President Trump promised, that we will be so sick of winning and that we will have economic growth that will actually be touching the sorts of working class voters that elevated Trump to the presidency?
Listen, they have set the expectations so high for what they can do with this economy right now. I mean, the economy's only been growing about 2%. Sort of year after year, very slow recovery, and they've been talking 4%. At times, if you did the math on the Trump budget, he's talking about like 11% growth. From that's like China in the 90s or something. So I think it is reasonable that with good policy, you could get somewhat faster growth over a sustained period. But I think to tell people that this is just going to be like the 1980s, where all of a sudden we're going to get this burst of fast growth, because we're not coming out of a recession. And there's all other reasons. We have productivity, which is very weak, and that's very hard to turn around. You have slowing population growth and labor force growth, all those things. It's going to be very hard to get the economy to grow much faster. And try to sell people that all we have to do is, there's too many magic bullets in Republican economic ideology. If only we do these one or two things, it is going to unleash this economy. I think there are a number of things we would have to do, kind of a portfolio of pro-growth things, but I think over a long period of time can get this economy growing faster. So yeah, expectations are way too high. So I think there's going to be a lot of disappointed voters when not only do we not get super fast growth, but as far as how that is distributed to the rest of the economy, it might not be much different than what we've seen over the past 10 years.
Oren, I want to come to you on this next. Do you think that conservatives have been adequately focused on economic mobility for the working class? And do you think that in this new Trump presidency era, that will become more of a focus?
Well, I mean, I think historically they have not been. I think the hypothesis has been rudely described as trickle-down economics, more politely described as a philosophy of rising tide lifting all boats, which historically has been true. Historically, if you got economic growth, that was widely shared. And what changed is that we have seen economic growth not being widely shared. And that requires an adjustment in policy. And I think that's something that a good outcome of the Trump administration could potentially be to make people recognize that, to say there has to almost be a second half of the sentence. We're going to get economic growth, and we have a plan for ensuring it is more widely shared than it has been over the last few expansions. The challenge, I think, is that the Trump agenda doesn't do that. The Trump agenda, I think, is very long on defining problems, which is valuable and constructive, but incredibly short on practical solutions. And I think that feeds right back into what Jim said, which is that you're likely to have a lot of very disappointed voters. And the reality is that the good policies, and we can talk more about what should an agenda look like, the good policies aren't Reagan-style, get the economy growing again next year. You know, it has taken us, I would say, 15 to 20 years to dig the hole that we're in. And if I'm always being so sunny and optimistic, we could shoot for 15 to 20 years from now having dug back out. But how you sell that as a political proposition is a lot harder.
Well, I think a follow-up to that then is, take something like tax reform. If a piece of tax reform is we're going to cut the corporate tax rate, we're going to cut the top income tax rate. I mean, these sorts of things that many conservatives really like but are not obviously connected to the bottom line of someone who's a working class voter who maybe is a truck driver in Ohio. Meanwhile, you have all of these other forces like automation and such that are really sort of bearing down on Trump voters. What are things that you think conservatives need to be mindful of then to make sure that the policies they're pursuing are actually addressing these things?
Yeah, I'll say one more thing about that, which is I think you've described it well, and I think the way that we have to understand the challenge and something that we got wrong is the idea that labor markets don't just function like all other markets. If somebody loses job X, it doesn't mean they can just go take job Y that's going to be just as good. And a lot of kind of standard Econ 101 theory just sort of fudges over that. And so what we are increasingly facing is a distribution of skills and workers in this country that does not align with the work that we have in the country to do. And so the question is, how do you move those things closer together? And I think some of it is in the labor market itself. I personally really like the idea of just subsidizing wages directly. If we want more people working, subsidize work at the low end of the market. But then there are also questions on the supply side of what kinds of workers do we have coming into this country who compete for the work. Trump may want no workers, but again, you have to ask which kind. Are the workers who are coming in workers who feed an oversupply or who meet areas where we have a lot of unmet demand? And then on the demand side, are we encouraging the kind of economic activity, especially industrial activity, that is going to create jobs? The theory of environmentalism and fighting climate change is that every time an industrial facility opens, that creates a negative externality that we have to fight. And the reality at this point in time may actually be that those things are creating positive externalities, not negative ones. And we need government policy to be pushing for more of them, not less.
April?
I mean, my role is generally not being the sunny optimist, but sitting between these two, I think that's the role I've got to take today. I think that there's an enormous amount of opportunity. I think if Congress can take some of these concerns that Trump has identified and the voters that he's identified that I think are frustrated with the modern economy, they haven't shared in the prosperity of, this recovery, and if they're able to sort of connect with those folks over real kitchen table issues that affect them, I think there's a possibility to sell some really good conservative policy. I mean, let's just think about things that cost people a lot of money, that cause a lot of economic anxiety for folks. I think childcare costs. I think there's an opportunity for conservatives to say, we need to give more money to families. They need that money in the form of tax cuts or credits. We need to allow parents to have more of their money so that they can figure out where their kids, how their kids are going to be taken care of while they're working, whether or not they want to use that money to help subsidize a parent that wants to stay home more or not work as much, or whether they want to use that money for childcare costs. I think Congress has the ability to take on issues like higher education, where I think there's actually a lot of bipartisan possibility. Now that sort of free college is off the table and we're talking a little bit more in the realm of reality, I think there are all kinds of things we could do to kind of break up the higher education, cartel and allow for more options for people that are affordable and meet their needs, particularly when they're mid-career and they realize they need new skills. So I think there are possibilities for sort of reaching folks at a level that is actually where they would feel the benefit. Healthcare is another big one. That's a lot of people are dealing with rising healthcare costs. They weren't able to keep their doctor, their premiums went up. Or maybe they're just now eligible for Medicaid, and they've got health care for the first time. And I think Republicans have an opportunity there to provide a solution that could really they would see the effect of. In terms of growth as an overall, if tax reform is going to get us there, look, I think growth is really going to come out of the corporate side. And I think that they just have to be a little bit more creative on the individual side. They'll probably have to pare it back. It's going to be really expensive. It doesn't seem like they're going to be able to get this border adjustment done. That's that's their big pay for. But I do think Republicans are going to be looking at this in terms of the dynamic score, and when they look at it that way, it's not nearly as expensive. So it's top priority for Ryan. He'll get something done.
So we've talked a lot about healthcare reform and we've talked a lot about tax reform. But there are two other big issues that were sort of unmistakable as a piece of Donald Trump's message on the campaign trail, that we've got a bunch of bad trade deals we need to renegotiate and we need to build that wall. So in both cases, these sort of present challenges or highlight cleavages within the conservative movement. So first I want to talk to you, Jim, about the trade issue. For conservatives, if we assume that conservatives are free traders, which you may want to push back and challenge that assumption, what are the prospects for conservatives to achieve victories on the issue of trade during a Trump administration?
I expect on trade it will be a succession of catastrophic defeats. Not just for conservatives, but generally for people who believe in that economics is basically right, has been right for 200 years about trade. So if you think that they kind of have that story right, that's not going to be a good 4 years. If good stuff happens on tax reform, and it very well could, and if we do some stuff on higher ed, despite the fact that the Trump higher ed policy has been that we need to kick the hell out of college costs. Let's just assume all that stuff happens. We could be so bad on trade that it would more than negate that. If there's been one consistency in Donald Trump for 30 or 40 years, it's that he thinks that America's number one economic problem is that other countries have been screwing America on trade. And that is his economic theory, and that explains everything. That is his, that explains it all. That very bad trade deals. And so that is, I imagine that is going to be the heart of his economic agenda. And if you look at who he's hired at Commerce, trade rep, he has hired this guy, Peter Navarro, author of Death by China. I think we can see where his views on trade are, to be a key economic advisor, but that is going to be a huge part of his economic agenda. And it would not be hard at all to screw up the global economy, not just through like a tariff on a Chinese product or even a tariff barrier, but this guy Navarro, the other day, he's saying he wants to sort of undo all the global supply chains that not only bring us, iPhones, but also Boeing Dreamliner jets. So I think the potential downside risk there, which I think Wall Street has been totally overlooking during the stock market rally, where they focused on the deregulation, fantastic, corporate tax cuts, fantastic, but not that all this trade stuff, which they assumed was just kind of stuff he said in the campaign, that he actually believes it, because I think he's actually believed it. My God, he talked about it on Oprah.
Let's talk a little bit about the wall question then. Again, this was a key piece of what Donald Trump would talk about on the campaign trail, and yet I would suggest that border security is something you can plausibly say this is a conservative principle. The wall itself, though, as a symbol, as a piece of infrastructure, it certainly costs money. This is now creating an interesting debate on the right. So I'd be interested in your take on when two pieces of conservatism come at odds with one another, something like border security and spending money on something like a wall. How do you think that conservatives in the next few years are going to resolve those challenges?
Well, we've already got, guys in
You
the
lose,
Freedom
April.
Caucus.
You get the wall question.
I mean, I think we've already got.
Who's going to pay for the wall? You don't have to say anything.
Oh, that's
it's
right.
not
I
a
forgot
problem.
Mexico's going to pay for the
It's
wall.
paid for. You've already got guys in the Freedom Caucus. I believe it was someone from the Freedom Caucus is trying to sell, the idea that what we really need to be talking about is debt to GDP, not, 10-year budget windows where things balance, because it's just, these numbers just don't work, and they're not going to work. It's going to be incredibly expensive to pursue a wall and a military buildup and a healthcare, replacement plan and a big tax reform package. I mean, all these things are just adding up. And the wall's not going to be easy. It's not going to be cheap. It will, I think it does have to be built for Trump to, I just think he's got to prioritize that. I think he'll get a lot of it built, if not all of it. He'll get enough of it built that he can make the case that he's, doing what he needs to do. But this is, it's going to crowd out other stuff. I mean, these are the kinds of things that we worry about as conservatives. Is like, look, we misread the public on a lot of things. I think conservatives did, certainly DC conservatives, maybe not you, Oren, but like the DC conservatives, I worked for Jeb Bush, we misread the public on a lot of things. And one of those is that, they just don't seem that concerned about budgets.
I think it has been interesting watching the way in which, if you think about the Republican primary, part of how Donald Trump put together his coalition was not just going after conservative Republicans, but actually winning over a lot of moderates, and it sort of scrambled the way that the GOP sort of thinks about its voters. Another group that Donald Trump was able to really reach into were not necessarily Republican voters, but again, sort of white working class voters in Appalachia, and a big issue there is coal. A big issue there is energy policy and pushing back against what the Obama administration had done with things like the Clean Power Plan. Oren, given that energy is an issue that you study a lot, what do you think are the prospects for a conservative energy agenda of some kind to become enacted in the next 2 to 4 years?
I think energy is one of the places where we'll probably make the most progress. In part because it's one of those ones that I was describing earlier that really doesn't require very much legislation. I suppose in a kind of hypothetical world, you could imagine legislation that would make progress and that would entrench the policy against the next Democratic president. But in terms of what can be done quickly through the Interior Department, through the EPA, you really can unwind most of what President Obama did and go just as far as in the other direction. I think one thing that people on the left did not appreciate right away. There were a lot of stories about, it's going to be very hard for Donald Trump to undo the Clean Power Plan. And, not only is it going to be easy for him to undo the Clean Power Plan, but if he brings the same creativity to interpreting and applying environmental and energy policy that the Obama administration did, he can do stuff so far outside of what anyone is thinking about that Congress isn't really an issue. And this also happens to be a place where Trump himself aligns fairly well with the standard conservative agenda. So I think this is probably the place where all the ducks are most lined up. And what you'll see in particular is on the environmental side, a real both rollback of the concrete rules that the Obama administration put forward, but also more generally a rollback of the kind of case-by-case obstacles. The pipelines are a very good example of this, where, you can approve or not approve of the Keystone Pipeline. There was no actual environmental basis for blocking it. Even the State Department said that. It was only because of leadership on climate that they were going to block it. You could say the same thing about the Dakota Pipeline. So having a policy of, no, actually we want pipelines from an infrastructure perspective, from an energy policy perspective, is going to make a huge difference. And then with respect to energy policy proper, opening up access to more of America's energy resources. A term that is getting used more and more is not energy independence, but energy dominance. And of course that sounds great to the Trump administration. But the U.S. really does have resources on that scale at this point, and that is something that we already saw exploding under an Obama administration that was not very happy about it, and I think we can see go a lot farther with an administration that actually wants to push it.
That you said the president has far more power on the energy than you would imagine. It's exactly the same with trade. That while you really need Congress to do trade liberalization, if you really want to be protectionist, the president has almost carte blanche on what he can do. So if that's really the direction they want to go in those two areas, he can do quite a bit. That's right.
I want to then ask you also about financial regulation. So much of the Dodd-Frank law was sort of instructions to go make rules, and so it seems to me that with something like Dodd-Frank, you don't necessarily need Congress to get involved to do an awful lot to change that. Jim, what do you see on the horizon for financial regulation?
Well, I mean, they're trying to cook up this deal where you're going to have like an alternate, there's going to be an alternate financial regulatory scheme that banks can choose. They can either go with Dodd-Frank or this whole other scheme, which remind me of a lot of Republican tax plans where, if you like this tax scheme, you can do it. If you want this one, you can do that. That seems like maybe you really don't want to make a decision as a legislator. I think there may be bits they're going to try to roll back, such as some of this living will stuff. Listen, I think the best reform would actually be. The Republican line at this point on Dodd-Frank is that's why the economy's bad. That's a big reason why the economy's been so slow. You may have gotten safer banks, but look what it's done to the economy. I'm not sure the banks are necessarily a lot safer. I'm also not sure it's actually done very much to slow the economy. So again, we're going to be spending a lot of energy next few years on something which, in the end, if your goal is faster economic growth, really might not do a lot to make growth faster. And I'm worried you'll actually end up with doing something that won't make growth faster, and on the other hand, might actually make banks even weaker. Though obviously that is doing something on Dodd-Frank is a huge issue, and it's one reason obviously why Wall Street. I think the number one performer in the Dow has been Goldman Sachs, since the election.
Well, I think this leads to my last question before we open it up to questions from the audience, which is, how should Congress deal with this administration if conservatives in Congress, whether they love the president or view him very skeptically, for conservatives in Congress, what are the things that they should be trying to do or to push for to see the most conservative victories come out of this presidency? April?
Well, I think that conservatives should be very Republicans generally should be very transactional with this president. This is not a guy you want to carry water for. He's just as likely to tweet about you tomorrow and throw your election in jeopardy as he is to campaign for you. And so I don't think there's a lot of point in sort of having the traditional relationship that a party has with their president, where you kind of get in line and the president submits his budget priorities and you guys all kind of you put together your own budget that looks pretty close, and you decide you're going to share his priorities and you're going to get in line. I don't know that there's a lot to gain from that. I think a transactional relationship is not only sort of preserves your ability to walk away from all this when it all goes to hell inevitably, which I think it probably will. But you.
This is such an optimistic group that I've got up here.
You said you were assuming.
Republicans in the
there
White
is
House,
hope,
and yet
just
this
not
is
for us. Just not for us. No, I do think that you've got to maintain. Look at all these guys who endorsed him. My heart bleeds for these guys who were dumb enough to endorse him in the primary or in the general, most of them in the general, and then this Billy Bush tape comes out and they all have to walk it back, and it's just so embarrassing. It's like, I think the smartest thing here is to just try to get what you can get and not sort of be on like team Trump. And I think there's some hope for this in the sense that, you don't see 25 senators lined up to be surrogates for him on cable news. I mean, you just don't. There's like a cast of regulars who are the Trump folks, but it's nothing like you would have seen with George W. Bush or with President Obama. So I think there's a sense in which everybody knows they're very likely to get burned here, and they're just trying to keep some distance. And I think that's smart. I think what Congress should do is be Congress. They should take back whatever power they can. I mean, I'm all for them using the Congressional Review Act as much as possible and trying to deal with all kinds of regulatory issues, which, you know, frankly, Trump should be mostly supportive of. I mean, what he said, he wants to get rid of 70% of regulations or something. Well, let's let Congress, you know, start doing that. I think, you know, Senator Lee is doing some really important work, I think, with this Article 1 group that he's got, this project that he's got, where he's trying to deal with things like the president's ability to sort of unilaterally make, you know, trade deals and tariffs and things like that. He's trying to pull some of that, that authority back where it originated. And I think that's really important. There's all kinds of ways that Congress has sort of given away a lot of its authority. Much of that is in rulemaking and in you know, other sort of ways that they've ceded a lot of their authority, and I think they need to try to take as much of that back as they can. And again, just have a sort of transactional relationship with the president where when their interests align, or when they can sort of make the case that they are connecting the dots between, you know, what the president has identified, and I think sometimes brilliantly identified as a, you know, a real concern of a lot of voters that other Republicans just didn't see or feel or, you know, didn't hear from their donor class. But the president is able to sort of identify these things that Congress needs to be ready to meet those challenges with conservative responses. And I think, you know, where they have an opportunity is that this White House doesn't have a lot of ideas. They just don't have a lot of plans. They don't have a lot of ideas. And so if you can get there first and you can convince, you know, the president that this is something that's in his interest, you know, there are opportunities. I don't have very high hopes for a large percentage of those things passing. I think with any other Republican presidential candidate up there, we'd have a better ratio of success here. But I do think that, you know, we shouldn't give up yet.
And April's our optimist.
Yeah.
If anybody has questions, I think now is a good time.